So now I'd like to talk about problem 16A, and I like this problem because it kind of summarizes relationships between different financial statement items, financial statements. And so you have here an income statement, and you need to find out what the fees or revenues are. Then you have retained earnings statement, and you need to determine some other numbers there. And then in the next page, you have the balance sheet and the statement of cash flows, which will give us, we need to determine various items. So it's a good exercise because it summarizes kind of like our current understanding of various financial statement relationships. So let's start with the income statement, and we're just going to basically fill the blanks in the various elements here. All right. So on the income statement, we're given actual net income. All we need to figure out is the revenues. Of course, remember that net income is simply revenues minus expenses. What you don't know is you don't know the revenues, item A, and you don't know supplies expense, items B. However, you do know what the total expenses are, right? So, from that perspective, finding out revenues is very straightforward because revenue should be just net income. You need to add back total expenses, and it will give you item A, right? So A is 275,000 plus add back 475,000 in expenses, and that's 750,000. So A is 750. Item B is simply just a plug because you know what the total expenses are. You need to just figure out, because it's a basic equation: 300 plus 100 plus B plus 20 plus 25 equals 475. So that's, you can calculate that it will be 475 minus the remaining total expense of 445. So that should be 475 minus total remaining expenses of 445 for 30,000 in this case. Alright, so income statement for that reason is pretty straightforward, but it already gives us a little bit additional information for the next statement of retained earnings, because one of the items that is missing in the statement of retained earnings is net income, which we know from here. Right, so D is simply 275. It needs to be. The rest of it we can't currently answer because we don't know what the ending retained earnings are, nor we don't know what the beginning retained earnings are. So that suggests we need to go to our next statement, which is the balance sheet. And on the balance sheet, you need to figure out what G is. Well, G is simply the sum of total assets. So just let's add up to find out what total assets were. The total assets were 462,500 plus 12,500 plus 150,000. So G is 625,000. Well, it means that J also has to be, because it has to balance 625,000. All right. Well, if J is 625,000, we know that liabilities is 100,000. We know current stock was 375,000. Well, you know, basically we need to find what age is. It's 100,000 plus 375,000 plus H, which is the retained earnings, equals 625,000. Right? So we need to solve for H as just a sum. So 620. We need to basically take 625 minus 475 is, so it must be that H is 150,000. I is simply sum of 375 plus 150. It's a subtotal of 525. Alright, now most importantly, we figured out that retained earnings at the end of the period is $150,000. Now, don't forget, we still have to figure out a bunch of stuff from statement of retained earnings, but now we have the information to answer that question, because now we know that retained earnings at the end of the year is $150,000. We know now also the net income, and we know the dividends. So remember that now we can remember that the basic retained earnings equation is ending retained earnings equals beginning retained earnings plus net income minus the dividends. Well, we know what the ending retained earnings are. We just figured it out. It's 150,000. We know that net income is 275,000, and we just know it from the income statement. We know the dividends are 125. Those are given. So now we just can solve for beginning retained earnings. So beginning retained earnings then is simply 150,000 minus 275,000 plus 125,000, and it's actually zero. That's if you solved it for that, it's actually zero. So C is zero, and that means the change in retained earnings was just 150,000. That's E. Okay? So that's how you kind of answer the question, how you answer the first three statements. Then we have statement of cash flows here. For the time being, I want to stay away from it. Because we haven't really talked about statement of cash flows. I'll come back to statement of cash flows at some other time. So, for the purposes of the exam and so on, I just care to understand the relationship between the first three statements. So that concludes this problem.